And there's like this analogy of a goldfish. And so there are these two goldfish and they're swimming in a fishbowl. And one goldfish says to the other, "Hey, how's the temperature of the water?" And the other goldfish says, "Wait, what's water?" And so water is this invisible substance that is surrounding the fish at all times of the day, but yet they don't see it. And if a fish tries to, let's say, go above water, it can't because the water limits its behavior. And so that water for someone with social anxiety could be anxiety, but they just don't even know until they have an experience that shows them the opposite of that.
That's Mark Metry, 22-year-old entrepreneur and author of the book Screw Being Shy. Learn how to manage social anxiety and be yourself in front of anyone. He's on a mission to spread awareness about social anxiety, help people cope with its symptoms, and overcome them.
For someone who experiences social anxiety to this degree, it can be super hard to actually find out because the human mind is the worst prison to be locked into because you don't know where the jail cell begins and ends.
For Mark, learning how to overcome his own struggles while also reframing his mindset and approach was critical to launching and driving his career. But what did it take to get there, and what has he learned in the process? Welcome to the Strategic Momentum Podcast, the show where we share tips, stories, and advice from progressive leaders on how to break through business and career inertia so you can better understand the business of work. I'm your host, Connie Steele. Recently on the podcast, we've been digging deeper into those important soft skills that can drive business and career momentum. Whether you're the leader of a company or a new hire, understanding and developing your EQ is one of those skills that's essential to career success. But for some, breaking out of one's comfort zone to build meaningful connections with others can be a bit more challenging. If you're one of the many with social anxiety, the thought of networking or having difficult conversations with your boss or peers can trigger negative emotional responses. And if you manage someone with social anxiety, you might mistake their behavior for a lack of motivation. But really, that's not the case. On top of being an entrepreneur and author, Mark Metry is the host of the Global Top 100 Humans 2.0 podcast, an MC and a TEDx speaker on topics including human potential, mindset, social anxiety, mental health, and personal transformation. But to get where he is today, he's had to overcome his own barriers to realize that transformation. Today, Mark shares his personal journey and what led to the creation of his book. He also provides tips and advice for breaking through that anxiety, and we discuss how to better understand those who may suffer from social disorders. We'll start with Mark's story.
My story started 22, 23 years ago. And my parents, they came to this country, to America from Egypt. They won like a green card lottery and they came over here, didn't really know English, didn't have any friends, came here with $200. I remember having a very, very simple childhood. Nothing too crazy happened, but it's just a lot of moving around. And for me, when I look back at my story as kind of what was the most impactful, I remember between second and third grade, when I was a kid, my family and I moved out of sort of the inner city to a small town. And the really interesting part about this town with 5,000 people in it was that there was no racial diversity whatsoever. And also at this time, this was like post 9/11 in America. And so, I remember being a kid and just facing a ton of pretty extreme racism, abuse, bullying. And also at that same time, I began to develop physical health issues like asthma, issues with my gut, appendix, insomnia, bladder. And that to me, when I look back at that now, that was sort of the onset of something that I talk about all the time. And I wrote a book about it, of social anxiety. And so I just sort of spent almost like a decade of my life kind of in that bubble of just not being able to talk to people, not being able to make eye contact. And as a result of that, not really doing much with my life, just placing a lot of boundaries. And so, it wasn't all bad. I definitely tried to cope with it by becoming sort of like an online entrepreneur when I was very young, like 12, 13 years old. Became financially successful around 15, 16, which really kind of led me to start asking the questions of what really is success, what really is happiness, because I've sort of achieved it. I've checked it off the box, but yet I still kind of hate myself. And so that kind of led me down this journey when I was 18 in college to where I actually began to realize a lot of the things that I've just said. And I began to sort of put my best foot forward. And at first, that sort of tanks. And what I mean by that is, I remember I got in so much stress. I was living in so much fear that by the time I was 18, I began to just try to kind of like escape the pain that I was in with alcohol, drugs, partying. Definitely food was my vice of choice. And I remember this time where I had gained a ton of weight in a short period of time. And next thing I know, I'm obese. I'm 220 pounds. My lifelong social anxiety transforms into social isolation. And I really get depressed seriously for the first time in my life. And that eventually led me to kind of being suicidal for about a month of my life. And that was sort of towards the end of 2015. And that was sort of the foundation in which that I used to just totally go on the offense of my life and change everything around. And that's what led me to starting a business. That's what led me to start a podcast. That's what's led me to write a book, to become a speaker, to be on an Amazon Prime documentary series. And really, I like to talk about a lot of things, but I think the main thing for me is just kind of going through everything that I've gone through. I've just now understood that, whatever sort of umbrella term that you want to use to describe like quote unquote mental health, I like calling it brain health. In my opinion, is probably the most important thing, because I've been in a spot in my life where, I've had more money than I knew what to do with. And, on my podcast, for example, I've had on people from, like the founder of Netflix to billionaires who have told me, they had $250 million in their bank account and yet they were going to kill themselves. And then after kind of going through that, I'm like, wow, this is like the number one thing that I think is the most important to be talked about, because it's an issue that I think impacts all of us, but it's very much invisible until something maybe drastic kind of happens. So that's sort of where I've been pointing most of my life's work towards.
I know this passion for really understanding the root cause of what sort of formulated this social anxiety that you mentioned, really understanding why this was happening to you and how to break through is just so critical, and kind of getting to, what life is all about has been some of this sort of mission that you've been focused on. So let's kind of get to defining what shyness and social anxiety really is, because, you certainly mentioned that when you were younger, this is what you were going through and you weren't quite sure what was happening. And I know in the book, you pointed out that this can get mislabeled as someone being an introvert. So help us clarify all of that, because there's lots of labels, there's a lot of terms. Mental health is a big issue, but I think people try to simplify it sometimes by just labeling things as your X, your Y, your Z, when they're not really kind of getting to sort of the root things of understanding what it truly is and how they're interrelated.
Yeah, absolutely. So, when you look at the psychology definition of what being an introvert really means, an introvert is someone who predominantly, like the way that their brain works, has a tendency to do so is to focus more on the internal world, thoughts, feelings, emotions, be more introspective, and therefore they get energy from that. And so, I think a big part of my message is that society says that the person who is, sitting alone at, let's say, the cafeteria or at a cafe or at the library is doing so because he or she is an introvert. And that could totally be the case. And there's nothing wrong with being an introvert. I am for sure, hands down, an introvert. But also the reality is that there's nothing wrong with being an introvert and kind of liking your solitude, liking your silence, kind of focusing on deep work. But the flip side to that is there are a lot of people who, maybe are born as introverts, but also begin developing a real sort of serious pattern of being shy. And, there's nothing wrong with being shy. Shyness is a totally natural emotion that, I think really all of us experience to some degree. If you're doing something new for the first time, maybe you're going to, an event in a city that you've never been to before with nobody that you know, and you're shy for like the first 5-10 minutes, that's totally okay. But there are people who, usually this starts off at a young age, who end up forming this pattern of shyness to a point where it becomes automatic and they can no longer control it. And so someone might be sitting alone at the library or cafeteria or wherever, and they're sitting alone, and it's not necessarily because they're an introvert, but they could also just be super shy and even have social anxiety to the point where they really could want to communicate to people. Maybe they do want to be social, but just their brain doesn't let them. And, essentially what this is that social anxiety is a real mental condition that is actually the most common anxiety condition in America, that usually is a result of psychological trauma. And so what I mean by that is, for me, when I was growing up and I kind of had that early experience of abuse and racism and violence, my brain basically said, life is hard. I went through something I didn't really know could exist. So I'm going to form a defense mechanism. I'm going to form a coping mechanism to deal with this trauma, to deal with the fact that, every time I try to talk, the fight or flight of my nervous system gets activated, which puts me in this emergency state where I can't think clearly. My mind starts racing and I can't really talk to people. And so, there were many, many times in my life where, I would walk into, let's say, a classroom or a room or some sort of a social situation, and I wouldn't even be anxious. I wouldn't even have thoughts of social anxiety. But next thing I know, I'm sitting down and, my leg starts tapping, my heartbeat starts to increase, my palms, my armpits start to sweat, and my throat tightens up and clenches up. And then my mind will look at my body and kind of see the fact that my body is anxious. And then my mind will sort of begin the anxious thoughts. And so basically you have this feedback loop between someone's thoughts, their mind, with their body and the physical signs of fear. And someone can be trapped into that and almost, lose their free will in social situations. And the real devastating part of this is that, if you've never experienced this, this can seem quite harmless. This can seem like, oh, what, so what, you're shy. A lot of kids are shy, this and that. But for the kids and people who are not in sort of a growing environment where they're not able to grow out of this, so to speak, this problem eventually impacts every single area of their life. It begins to, ruin their self-esteem.
Psychological trauma is often the root cause of social anxiety. And in Mark's book, he says that, quote, trauma is often the result of an overwhelming amount of stress that exceeds one's ability to cope or integrate the emotions involved with that experience. It's essentially when something you perceive based on your level of understanding of life so far goes wrong, unquote. And what goes wrong is something you have never faced or don't know how to process. It's not only reserved for devastating events like a violent act or being bullied, it can encompass events like being rejected by a friend, being mocked by others for saying or doing something different than everyone else. And the manifestation of that fear and internal turmoil leads to behaviors that impact one's ability to move forward in a healthy way.
If you look at like a study that Harvard did that tried to find what's the one sort of commonality of living a fulfilled and happy life is having deep and intimate relationships. And people with social anxiety can't really do that. And then, if you look at another study, for example, that was done by Stanford University, they followed people who had social anxiety from the time they were kids to, grown adults. And they found that, one, they usually had pretty terrible careers in the sense of they weren't really doing what they wanted to do. Because if you can't really talk to people and you can't really express who you are, then there's no way that you can kind of speak up for yourself at a meeting with a boss or just sort of trying to figure out your career. And they also found that people with social anxiety, out of a lot of other mental health conditions, is the most correlated with substance abuse. And the reason why is because, let's say you do have social anxiety and you do have to go to, let's say, a networking event or some kind of a social situation, they will be the first people at the bar to drink alcohol or maybe, consume some other kind of drug or substance to shift their state of mind so that they can't talk to people. And they also found that another big factor was social isolation. A lot of people who are socially anxious end up socially isolating themselves. And, that is probably one of the worst things that you can do for your mental health, to isolate yourself. And so I kind of took a look at all these different pieces that were going on in the world and not really seeing a real sort of thread that has been connected between people who are really suffering in kind of the same way that, I was almost suicidal. And thank God I didn't take my life, to, sort of seeing on how it actually starts off. And the reality is that our mainstream sort of mental health treatments and solutions don't really work for people who have social anxiety. There's enough stigma, there is enough hesitancy for the average person who might go through some mental health issues for them to talk about it with a stranger or even someone that they love. And it's like that, but times 10,000 for people who have social anxiety that literally can't pick up the phone and call or talk to somebody. And so a big part of my book is kind of looking at, if someone does face this issue, what are some of the things that they can do by themselves, by their own first? And then, as they get more comfortable, as they begin to sort of peel these layers back and they decide that they do need help, then they can, call a doctor or see a therapist. And so, yeah, I mean, it's a super interesting kind of puzzle.
Oftentimes, people dealing with social anxiety seek escape or temporary relief, whether through substances or through physical distance. They retreat into their comfort zone and can lose the ability to live life in the present. And the very thing they're struggling with is exactly why they have a hard time seeking help. And while many people have experienced this social discomfort at some point, like feeling awkward at a party or being nervous before a presentation, people with social anxiety experience the effects to a debilitating extent. If you are someone who hasn't dealt with this personally, you might not pick up on why someone is being distant or is reacting in a certain way. In reality, it may not have anything to do with you. So, how can you start to identify the signs where somebody might be having some of those challenges at work?
I love that question. And yeah, I mean, there have been so many times in my life where, this is a time where I didn't really know that I had social anxiety, and neither did the people around me. And I remember just many, many different scenarios where maybe I was in a classroom or I was in some sort of a situation where a teacher or somebody would call on my name, and I would literally just go into full fight or flight, and I would just not be able to talk back to them. And a lot of times they would be offended by that and say, "Why aren't you responding back to me?" Which sort of causes more shame and guilt to pop up, which makes their situation even worse. And then you add that sort of social reinforcement, and it can be a really challenging situation. And so, this is definitely one of my goals, and sort of writing this book, because whether it's an organization, a workplace, or a school, or even a family, I just think we need to raise more awareness. I think the main thing is that, we need to put social anxiety in sort of a broader category of what I'm talking about in terms of mental health. And what I mean by that is like, a lot of organizations and a lot of people in schools will kind of have this kind of skewed viewpoint of mental health and say like, oh, mental health is is a problem for a certain percentage of the population. And the way that I view it is, if you have a body, like if you have a physical body, then you have a capacity for physical health. If you have a brain, then you have a capacity for mental health. And so I think that word in and of itself needs to really not necessarily be tossed out the door, but it really needs to be reevaluated. Because when I say that, what are we really talking about? Are we talking about somebody who was maybe born with some sort of a brain disability? Are we talking about someone who experiences kind of general anxiety and depression, which is normal? Or are we talking about somebody who has, schizophrenia, for example? And so I think that we really need to just go more into this kind of subject as a whole and understand that social anxiety is a part of this issue. It's sort of at a spectrum level. And so with social anxiety being sort of the most common mental health anxiety related issue in America, I definitely think that at an individual level, we need to prioritize sort of health and well-being. And, there are all sorts of treatments and potential solutions for this issue. But I definitely just feel like putting this more of a priority is important. And so I think kind of taking a look at it and understanding that, social anxiety doesn't necessarily look like somebody like in the scenario that I painted, where I was kind of sitting at 18, obese and suicidal in my room because I didn't know how to talk to people. But it could also look like a sort of very high functioning form of social anxiety, where someone is, trying to go to different kinds of meetings. They're probably self-medicating by like vaping something or drinking something, or people can even do this with like food and sugar or caffeine. And they're just sort of trying to balance this lifestyle that is actually causing them more stress.
Let's say the example of someone who may be highly functioning, and people may say, yeah, they're shy or they're an introvert, but their behaviors at work are mischaracterized, where they don't speak up in meetings, or they're looking down. It looks like they're not engaged in the meeting, when in reality, maybe they're afraid to speak up.
Yeah.
Or maybe when there's a project deadline and they're not communicating and they're missing deadlines. And that could be misinterpreted as they don't have commitment to the project. Maybe they're not competent in the project. But that is masking something that is much deeper and not a true reflection of this person's potential. So tell me a bit more about that, because I think by people being able to also be aware of these actions in the workplace, they may also be able to then diagnose for that other individual and realize, wow, maybe it isn't because they're this or that. Maybe there's something deeper and they can be more understanding about it. But usually most people's situation is they're going to label them as X immediately and not give them a second chance.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I love this question. And your nervous system chooses a response, or more like it reacts to a certain environment. And so for me, that was, sit down, shut up, don't talk. Nobody likes you. Nobody likes the way you look because you look different than people, and just don't speak up again. And for other people, their sort of psychological traumatic experience can have them cope in different ways. It could be, every time that when they went through this traumatic event, the way they dealt with it was by getting angry. And then now, whenever they feel triggered, they get angry at whoever or whatever the situation is, when in reality, it doesn't really have much to do with the actual situation that is playing out in hand, but it has to do with how their nervous system is reacting. And the real problem with this is that when this happens, your nervous system freezes. Your nervous system pauses. because it's trying to figure out what just happened. How can we process this so that we can take what we learned and implement it back into our own life so we can get on with life? But when someone's nervous system is sort of trapped, it's almost kind of like they're trying to take a square shape and put it in a round hole again and again and again and again and again. And that's what it looks like when someone is, for example, like people who have psychological trauma, they can't actually be in the present moment. They can't actually be focused because what happens is their brain is constantly trying to figure out the past of like, wait, what just happened? And as a result of that, it's taking that information and trying to project it into the future as a defense mechanism to make sure that this never happens again. And so people who face this, not even people who just have social anxiety, they are almost never in the present moment because they are constantly in almost like this psychological warfare between their past and their future, which is all happening technically right now in the present moment in their brain, but they're just not there. And so, social anxiety, what social anxiety sort of on the darker side looks like is, it could look like someone not speaking up in meetings, maybe that being misinterpreted. But the back end of that is that person who just went through that meeting and didn't speak up. Now, when they put their head on their pillow at night, they are literally replaying through all the social interactions that they had that day for like 4 hours. And they're constantly saying to themselves, I should have said this. I should have said that. Or maybe they reacted negatively out of impulse and they regret saying something. And, when you can't sleep or when you're staying out for 4 hours at a time and, you have to go to work the next day and wake up at whatever it is, 7 a.m., and you look at your clock and it's now 3 a.m., and, it takes you until like another hour to go to sleep. Now you're running on like 2-3 hours of sleep. And then the next day when that person shows up, they're not only extremely socially anxious, but they're now sleep deprived. And studies have showed both of these things of this almost like another feedback loop between social anxiety and sleep as to where someone won't really sleep because they have social anxiety. And then the next day, their social anxiety is even worse because their brain is inflamed due to them not sleeping, which then puts them at this another biochemical emergency level response where they might be, chugging cups of coffee, which, caffeine is fine depending on the individual, but too much of it can even cause anxiety. Or maybe they're eating that extra sugary muffin, and that's causing even more fear. And so this is almost like this very toxic cycle that someone is in literally every single day of their life, to where they are so much caught up in like the daily emergencies that the next chance that they get at trying to relax, and for that person, it might be doing drugs or drinking alcohol or watching Netflix or whatever it is, that's the only time they feel to give their brain a chance to relax. When in reality, they're not actually relaxing at all. They're just trying to escape from their life because they are constantly in almost like the psychological warfare of what I've said going on.
And what if you are one of these high-functioning people with social anxiety, but you don't know it? Like with many coping strategies, step one is awareness.
I was talking to a friend of mine who told me that a friend of his read my book and he kind of figured out that he had social anxiety. And then I had a conversation with him, and he told me that kind of like the months leading up to reading my book, there was like a subtle part of his brain that was telling him like, why can't you talk to people? Like, why do you react in this certain way? And so, to sort of get a full picture of of this issue, it can be much more difficult. And unfortunately, there's not like a 1 + 2 + 3 formula, because the reality is, and I quote this in the book, but for someone who experiences social anxiety to this degree, it can be super hard to actually find out, because the human mind is the worst prison to be locked into, because you don't know where the jail cell begins and ends. And there's like this analogy of a goldfish. And so there are these two goldfish and they're swimming in a fishbowl. And one goldfish says to the other, "Hey, how's the temperature of the water?" And the other goldfish says, "Wait, what's water?" And so water is this invisible substance that is surrounding the fish at all times of the day, but yet they don't see it. And if a fish tries to, let's say, go above water, it can't because the water limits its behavior. And so that water for someone with social anxiety could be anxiety, but they just don't even know until they have an experience that shows them the opposite of that. It's sort of a back and forth that someone has to gain that awareness first and then sort of figure out how do I begin to ask myself the right questions to actually see if I have this or not. And I think the biggest thing out of this is when you do figure out that you have this, for most people, it can completely change everything. Because previously, up to this moment in my life of discovering that I had social anxiety, I just thought that I was a failure. I just thought that I was born as some really special case where I just couldn't open my mouth and I couldn't talk to people. And I kind of viewed myself as a moral failure. But when I actually found out that, oh, wait, this social anxiety thing is like this thing in my brain that is working at like a neurochemical level, it sort of transformed more into like a science project, like a biochemical equation that I could begin to adjust and begin to change the inputs and maybe get a different output. And that's really what I think is the most powerful. When someone is able to realize this and understand that this is not like a moral dwelling. Like this is not something that you should have shame over. This is almost like a scientific health phenomenon that happens in a certain percentage of people in the population from culture to culture. A lot of us, we talk about fear, especially in terms of like anxiety. And what I found is that when I actually realized that I had social anxiety and I tried to kind of expose myself to these fears, like I remember I would try to go outside and talk to strangers. And when I tried to do that, that actually made my stress way worse because fear had really been controlling my life for years. And fear is it's both sort of this natural biochemical occurrence that is sort of running on our nervous system. And it's almost as well as like this master that really controls our lives and that creates boundaries and filters and kind of determines what we're going to say. And so a major thing that I had to learn is that you have to approach fear from a different angle. Because if you have been living in a state like where I have, where I was socially anxious for like a solid 18, 19 years, it's not like the next day you can get up and just be like, all right, I'm going to conquer my fears. You know, maybe if you don't necessarily have like this mental condition that has been conditioned for years, maybe, yeah, you can do that. But for people who kind of experience this, you have to look at fear from a different approach. And the angle that I talk about in the book is you have to look at fear from a biochemical level, because it's much easier for someone to begin to gain leverage on fear through biochemistry, because fear is a biochemical response in your brain.
Having social anxiety in a work environment can mean not showing up visibly like others, and that can be misconceived in a number of ways. But to overcome these misconceptions, it's important to first understand exactly what's happening when someone is reacting to a social situation. When looking at mental health and the various issues that can occur, one might not always think of it from the scientific point of view. It may be seen as self-inflicted versus it being this vicious cycle of traumatic events, which then have that chemical effect on an individual. If you have this anxiety, the result is that you tend to negotiate against yourself involuntarily, and that can negatively impact your relationships and your work. So how does understanding this biochemical process help you move toward managing your symptoms and behaviors?
You know, the amygdala sends different signals to the hypothalamus, and then that triggers different kinds of neurotransmitters to release, like serotonin, to fire off and then control your behavior and thoughts to get you to do this certain thing. When you look at it from that sort of biochemical filter, that's the angle you have to approach. And so, for example, A key neurotransmitter that I talk about in the book and is also mentioned a lot in like mental health communities and even leadership too. Like I know Simon Sinek talks about it, is serotonin. And serotonin does a lot of things in our body and brain, from regulating our mood to regulating our sleep to regulating even our appetite, as well as our functioning in social groups. And so serotonin is extremely important in general, but specifically for people who have social anxiety. And people who have social anxiety have some sort of a dysfunction, whether it's their body is producing too much serotonin or too little serotonin, or the modulators themselves are dysfunctional. And so something that totally blew my mind and actually completely changed my life when I actually discovered this was that, if you look at maybe like the last, maybe 20 years ago, a lot of the science said that because serotonin is a neurotransmitter, it's got to be in our brain, right? And the reality is that's only partly true. And now they've actually found out that the level of serotonin in our brain is just anywhere from 5 to 10%. And 90 to 95% of serotonin, this neurotransmitter that quite frankly controls a lot of our lives, is actually located in this thing, which is also new in science, called the gut microbiome, which is this ecosystem of trillions of bacteria that are between our stomach and intestines, where, when you go to eat something, believe it or not, a lot of our human cells can actually digest, just like the normal foods that we eat, like plants, for example. And so our gut actually processes them first and then hands it off to our human body to digest. And so when you begin to look at this and you begin to look at, there are certain nerves that connect our gut to our brain called the vagus nerve. And then you begin to look at, what are the main causes of sort of gut dysfunction? And the number one cause of gut dysfunction is having your body be in a chronically stressed, psychologically traumatic state, as to where, going back to the beginning of this, you are in this sort of loop of your nervous system constantly putting you in this fight or flight response, which, impairs digestion, which impairs a lot of the sort of other bodily functions in our body. And the number two is your dietary choices. And so the chapter in my book where I talk about this, it's called First My Gut Broke and Then My Brain Broke. And I talk about the only time in my life where I was seriously depressed and even suicidal was when I was sort of binging on food and using food as a coping mechanism. And it's not like I was binging on broccoli or like fish. I was binging on, whatever, Coca-Cola, all the kinds of junk foods, all the
comfort
things.
Food.
Comfort food in mass quantities. And so, when I kind of discovered that, and you kind of realize how much our food has to deal with the regulation and uptake of serotonin in our body, that really, really changed just how I kind of view this in general. Because it's a lot easier to kind of get somebody to start putting the right things in their mouth than stop doing the wrong things to their mouth, rather than telling them, someone who has a history of being deathly afraid of something for a decade, to tell them to go outside and just conquer their fears. Because the reality is that's just not going to work. And so if you can approach it from this different angle by actually looking at, okay, this is the biochemical response that fear has, maybe there are things that we can do to lessen that response in general. And that could be totally true. And I look at a study that I mentioned in my book from South Korea that took two groups of teenagers and fed one sort of a whole foods diet, nothing artificial. And they give the other group sort of the classic American standard diet with mostly made from comfort food. And they showed a 100% increase in suicidal ideation between the group who ate junk food and who didn't. And so, this topic it's pretty complicated, but it's also pretty simple.
To live a healthy life mentally and physically comes down to some core elements, and they're all interconnected. Your diet, lifestyle, and overall well-being is highly correlated with your degree of social anxiety. But often physical health can be easier to control than mental health. Introducing healthier foods and more exercise into your daily routines can drastically improve your mental health. The key is, like many other problem-solving situations, is to start small with a few repeatable actions and gradually turn those into habits. Mark states in his book that you have to learn to be a critical thinker and implementer in your own life. It's about developing this flow state of mind to help you get past your mind's inner critic. One place to start is with what Mark calls exposure therapy.
So I have a chapter in my book. It's called "Expose Yourself," and yeah, I mean, I kind of said at the beginning of how I kind of tried to set these kind of beginning challenges for myself at the beginning, but it didn't really work. And so I kind of did this after I had really begun to work on my biochemistry with healthy eating, sleep, exercise, sunlight. Going back to the basics. And so some of the examples I talk about in my book is, like, I remember I would go outside and I'd pull out a piece of paper beforehand in my journal and I write down, okay, Mark, you're going to go outside today and you're going to walk up to like 5 random people on the street and you're going to ask them what the time is. And I remember at first I tried to do this without writing anything down. And I just kind of told myself to just go outside and talk to people. And that was way too broad of a goal, where my brain basically saw that. And I remember like trying to go outside and talk to people. And after walking past like 30 different people, and my brain would tell me, okay, no, like just talk to the next person. Or, I would sort of make eye contact with someone. And then like my brain would immediately go into a fight or flight response. And it would strip me of my free will. What I began to do is I just sort of began to focus on like that very sort of 1+1 logical part. Because if you can do that, your brain can be a little bit more calculated and not be so open. And so I remember writing down like, hey, I'm going to go outside and talk to 5 random people and specifically only ask them what the time is. And so, I mean, it definitely took me a little bit to kind of do the first one. But eventually I did it. And then the feeling that I got after was extreme excitement. And
accomplishment, I'm sure. Complete accomplishment, because you were able to do those tasks. You started really small, really narrow, but that was a big accomplishment.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And the more you do that, the more you begin to kind of change how your brain interprets and perceives this feedback. And then I remember after I did that, I would say, I'm going to go outside and ask 10 people what the time is. Then also, how do I get directions to like, this cafe over there that I already kind of knew where it was, just kind of asking another logical question. And eventually I just kind of go down like this protocol. And then eventually I would kind of make it more open and try to leave someone a compliment, or I would actually try to sort of have some of these conversations. And so that's definitely, a piece of advice, a protocol that I would say someone to follow. And when it comes to kind of networking events, I remember as I was doing this, I began to kind of go to different kinds of events in my city that I would just go to alone. And I would try to do so to condition myself. And I mean, the really interesting part about this now is like, now I have memories of me like going to these events and then just completely failing. And then in my book, I kind of break down my steps in terms of like what to do at sort of networking and social events. The number one I say to people is don't use a Band-Aid solution. And what I mean by that is like, again, people with social anxiety have some of the highest correlations with substance abuse. And so it can be very easy to trick yourself to just like have a drink or to vape something outside before you walk in, or to go to, the dessert bar and fill yourself up with a ton of sugar. And the reality is I don't necessarily have a problem against any of those tools inherently. But if you are just trying to use anything to medicate yourself, that's a very short-term Band-Aid solution, because it hides the root problem and it makes it worse. And the second thing that I usually tell people is to do what that guy did to me, is to, quote unquote, seek out more introverts per se. And again, you can be introverted and not have social anxiety, but it makes it much, much easier to, like, if you're at an event, to just look at like the perimeter of the room, look at who's standing by themselves or sitting by themselves. And it's a lot easier to just walk up to them and introduce yourself. And what I tell people is if you're able to do this, and let's say you meet like 4 other introverts or people who are shy, maybe at the end of the night, you can, bring them in together and you guys can kind of have like a more open group conversation. The next thing that I tell people is to be more interested in others rather than to try to be interesting. Like, I think a lot of us face this problem, and this kind of goes with not focusing on yourself of like, if what I've learned is that, the human psyche can always find problems. And like what I mean, for example, is, anyone can sort of see this experiment. If you look at yourself in the mirror for like an hour, you're not going to run out of problems in your face. And like, you could be beautiful, you could look great. But if you are staring at yourself in the mirror long enough, your brain is going to constantly come up with problems. And so the directive for that is, anxiety usually always creeps up when you are just thinking about yourself and you're looking at yourself. And so instead of asking yourself like, what am I going to say if this person asks me this, or what am I going to do if this happens? The key is to ask other people just really interesting questions and try to genuinely understand about kind of who they are. And then the last one that I'd say is to set a specific intention. This is something that I still do today. And what I'll do is like, I will set a specific intention and I'll say like, hey, my goal speaking at this event is to change the perspective of how one person looks at this. My intention with this event is to introduce my friend Kevin to my friend Lauren, because I think they would make a really great synergy because they both do X, Y, and Z. And so I think if you can approach it from that angle, it redirects some of that energy. Because I know, like for me, if I just randomly walk into a room and I have no intention, you kind of leave that part of your brain to decide what it's going to use that energy for. And, sometimes that can be good in a spontaneous way. And sometimes it can be not so good. And it can kind of trigger social anxiety. And so that's kind of the way that I look at it.
Fear can be a motivator and an inhibitor, which we talked about with Dr. Mary Lamia in episode 6 and again in episode 9. Overcoming the fear of social situations can start by putting others first. Instead of focusing on your own fear, focus on who you can help, those who don't know where to go or what to do. And that can help you turn your self-critical thoughts on mute. That means you really have to come into social situations with intent. Think of it like a strategic plan. You set a goal for yourself before going into something. Once that's defined, figure out the strategies and tactics you're going to take to address that goal. When you can look at a situation in an objective way, it makes the thought of socializing a little less daunting. And for business leaders, creating environments for people to connect with purpose or simply do things for their mental well-being is critical to building a positive culture.
To give you an example, I was at VaynerMedia before this whole Corona thing happened. I was at VaynerMedia in New York City, which is Gary Vaynerchuk's media agency. And I was having a meeting with one of his executives, and I went to the bathroom. And in the bathroom, I was using it, and I looked up at the stall, and there was just like a poster. And this poster said, it had like a weekly schedule, and it said, hey, if you're interested in yoga, come take our yoga class at 10:30 a.m. on a Thursday. If you're interested in learning how to cook a healthy meal, come to this place at 1:30 p.m. And so I think the big thing with that is I think companies really need to understand that this stuff is important. And I think they need to understand that we really do need to have a balance because, telling someone to hustle or be productive from 9 o'clock to 5 o'clock is only going to go so much. But I think if sort of an employee sees that your company is taking time, taking the resources to almost sort of integrate these lifelong healthy lifestyle habits and routines into like a normal workday, they know. Another example of this is I have a friend of mine. His name is Rob Dubay. He's the co-founder and CEO of this company called Image One, and this company was ranked on like the Forbes list. And he told me that before all of his meetings, when people get in the room, they just sort of quickly and subtly do this ritual where they go around the room and they ask each person how they're doing from 1 to 10. And they don't ask them like why they're feeling that way. They just ask them to just sort of gain an understanding of like, if someone maybe is at a 2, maybe, don't push them extra during this meeting and just sort of give them space. But if someone is at, let's say, a 10, maybe then that is the time to push them and make them a little bit more proactive. And so there are many different things that people can do.
What do you think people need to think about now in terms of this interesting time we're in? Because we're now working virtually, being able to get out there and test and learn your way to, managing your social anxiety, which is something you had said in the book. It's like, it's not an overnight thing. You do have to try different things. How would somebody start to do that in this situation where you can't really get out?
My book came out literally the entire day that the world went on lockdown, March 14th. And so in terms of this being coincidental, I mean, obviously, I think the main thing that I've learned now, or maybe just assumptions that I have, are the fact that we are sort of all in like this temporarily sort of artificial environment where we are at home. Some of us are alone. Some of us are with our families and not really with our friends or doing much. I think that some people who sort of have social anxiety, but we're sort of tiptoeing on the line, and now they get to almost experience social isolation. I think a portion of them are going to realize that they do not like this. And whether it's now they start to read my book, by the time, this is over, who knows, 1 month, 2 months, 3 months from now, they'll be equipped with those tools. I had the chance of interviewing on my podcast one of the top neuroscientists and psychiatrists, Dr. Daniel Amen. And we were kind of talking about what was going on in terms of, we are going through a traumatic event as humans around the world. Everyone is. And the reality is a lot of people talk about, for example, like PTSD, post-traumatic trauma. And that's fine. But there's also, something that I experienced in my life of post-traumatic growth. And so I think some people are going to come out of this situation much stronger and kind of ask themselves the right questions. Like, if I wasn't really taking care of my health, when will I? Or, kind of making sure of their career and honestly just figuring out if what they're doing here on this planet is meaningful or not. Then unfortunately, I think that there's going to be a percentage of the population who regress and they actually get worse and they sort of develop, negative patterns in sort of this quarantine period. And by the time they get out, they're going to be worse, whether they are, having a ton of different kinds of fights, unhealthy fights with their family, or they just stop talking to people in general, or they start drinking a little too much alcohol and they get dependent or some other kind of drug. And so I think at the end of the day, as much as sort of I don't think it's somebody's fault that this happens, like I don't think it was my fault that I had social anxiety. It was definitely my responsibility though. And I think you have to separate both of those, because I think a lot of people get offended when you say, oh, that's your fault for this problem in your life happening. And the reality is that it doesn't really matter whose fault it is. It just matters your responsibility. And so for me, it's like, I ask myself, like, yeah, there's a lot of terrible things going on that I can't really control. But at the end of the day, no matter what happens, no matter whose fault it is, it's my responsibility to take care of sort of this body and this brain and this spirit that I was given, because I know that this is a gift. And if you can ask yourself that question, then I think it makes it much easier to focus on what you can control. And like, going back to kind of our earlier conversation on like, what is mental health? Is there a certain percentage of the population that's doing this? Well, these things start young. And, they've shown that, for example, cognitive diseases like dementia and Alzheimer's, they start from your lifestyle choices during your 20s. And so I think when you look at that, you really do begin to see, like, am I going to set myself up on a path of, growth, love, trying to do my best, trying to be fulfilled in my life? Or am I setting myself up on a path of trying to escape from these problems, trying to take the path of least resistance, trying to gain pleasure for 5 minutes, even though I know it's going to hurt later on? And that second path is literally what creates mental illness in the first place. It just might take a decade or 2 or 3, depending on your genetics, depending on sort of who you are. And then I also look at sort of the future of the world. And we now know that the leaders of the future are not even necessarily those that are more techie or are more tech savvy. They're those that have the strongest level of psychological resilience to where the point where they're not abusing technology. Because, I have friends that are in like the virtual reality industry, that run social media companies, that do a lot of cutting edge technology stuff. And the reality is that the people who are going to end up on top are those who don't let their neurochemistry, their psychology get hijacked by different forces, by different tools, by different, players on the field, so to speak. And so that is really another sort of big part of this conversation of the future of all of this is all about mental health. Because when we can live in a world where, certain jobs are automated, people don't necessarily have to worry about kind of like their income anymore. If technology does bring us to a point where it's very prosperous, the real question, the real issue at hand is going to be, how do we sort of cope with this? How do we make sure that our minds don't go crazy? Because our brains are a product of thousands and thousands of years of evolution. And in the last 150 years, throughout this industrial revolution, we're just beginning to sort of see these things pop up. We can now consume foods that didn't really exist like 25 years ago. And so that is a major part of the conversation that I'm super, super focused on. Because, unfortunately, I think people who kind of do face these issues, they are going to get sucked into what I sort of call the digital vortex, the abyss. Or if it's not with digital stuff, it'll be with alcohol, it'll be with some kind of substance, or it'll be with some kind of emotion. Everyone has their own vice, but I think now is the time to focus on these things. And then if you're listening to this and you do realize that you kind of are at a situation where you don't know what to do, or maybe you feel like things are really worse off for you, I would say to do research and to look at other people's stories. Look at other people's stories who have been in the same exact position that you are in right now, and what they did differently and what path they took. And that's what I did. That's how I've been able to get out of what I've done. And, that's what I wish for everyone else too, to kind of find their own path that is unique to them. But some of us can kind of, be stuck. Some of us can kind of need a little bit of help. And I think a big sort of illumination as a part of that, as sort of a vehicle, is someone else's story. Like, I remember I was listening to another podcaster who had talked about the time where they tried to kill themselves in college. And when I was listening to that, in that moment, you really just sort of begin to see sort of a light at the end of the tunnel. And you really begin to realize that, oh, it's not just me.
Yeah, totally. The key thing that I walked away with is that to really help you gain that strength, or really the competitive advantage going forward is or I should say the competitive advantage for leaders in the future is this mental competitiveness versus digital competitiveness. Because that's essentially where you see everything going, is that people are relying too much on the technology to kind of guide where you should be going, what you should be doing, versus getting back to the more human level of things, going back to basics and what really drives somebody and creates that balance overall to help deliver
so the best somebody can be. And to close, what advice would you tell other up and coming leaders, to help them as they move up in the world?
Yeah. So what I would say is, I heard this from someone by the name of Jay Shetty, who I got a chance to sit down with early last month in New York City.